Hello and welcome to the first video in my new History GCSE exam masterclass. Think of this as a masterclass in exam technique, structure and writing skills. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know so that when you're in the exam, nothing is overwhelming. We're going to be looking at understanding what the question is asking you, how to structure your response, and then key language techniques to help you hit those higher level answers. So let's go. So today we're looking at History GCSE Paper 3. Now, the particular question is how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into, and then it will go into a particular focus that the question has. Now, although we're focusing on Paper 3 today, this question does actually come up in Paper 1 as well in the depth study. So whether you're studying crime and punishment or medicine, you will also see this structure question in that paper too. And the techniques are exactly the same. So anything you learn today, you can put into application for that question. It's worth noting, first of all, we will be following the exam specification for Pearson Edexcel. And in particular, I'm going to be using the paper Weimar Nazi Germany for my tutorial today. However, if you study any of these three papers as well, this question will also apply to those as well. So this question comes up in section B, and the numbering of the question is 3A. Now this can come up in a variety of different forms in terms of the historical context that it's going to apply to and the particular focus of the question. But it's always going to stay in the same structure. So the question is going to be worded the same every time. So what I like to do first is I like to pick out some of the key features of the question to make sure that we're really thoroughly understanding what it is asking us to do. The first part seems quite basic, study sources B and C, but I cannot stress enough that you need to locate sources B and C in the source booklet at the back of the paper, and you need to read them both thoroughly before starting the question. So take time, read them carefully, have a highlighter in your hand, maybe be highlighting some key elements, then start to plan your response. The second part is picking out the key focus of the question. So here we have cultural changes. So this particular question isn't talking about the growth of the Nazi Party. It isn't talking about economic failures of the Weimar Republic. It isn't talking about popularity of extremist movements. It is asking you particularly about cultural changes. And in the exam mark scheme, it will always say that the answers need to link to the conceptual focus of the question. And this is exactly what you're doing here if you stick to these key focuses. So we're not just talking about the source in general, we're saying why it's useful for cultural changes. And the third one is your knowledge. You need to make sure that you include your contextual understanding of the history surrounding this source to make sure that you aren't stuck in level 1. If you don't include your own knowledge, you will struggle. So coming up in this video, we're going to start by looking at the exam structure. Then we're going to move on to understanding some techniques about how to answer this particular question. Then we're going to look at a couple of model answers and pick apart what is good about those. Then finally, we're going to touch on some examiner comments. Skip to the part that's most relevant to you. If you feel like you need to watch the entire video, please do. If not, use the chapter markers in the timeline to skip to the part that you need help with the most. So the first thing we're going to look at is structure. Now, this is a source-based question, so you need to make sure that you are constantly referring and making inferences to the sources it has given you in the exam paper. The key thing to remember with this, consider the usefulness of both of the sources separately. It has given you A and B. What the question is asking you, is source A useful for this? And is source B useful for this? So at no point in that question does it ask you to do a comparison between the two sources. So that's my first common mistake. Don't waste time comparing the sources with each other because it's just not needed. Never say the source is not useful. I have seen a lot of student responses that dismiss the source because they say it isn't useful for this investigation, because what you're saying to the examiner is you cannot apply the limitations of this source to why that aids in a historical investigation. And the third one, also do not dismiss provenance. If it is a personal account from a diary, if it is a newspaper, if it is propaganda, please don't say this isn't useful because it's bias. Everything in this question has a use, and a historian can make inferences from even things that might seem particularly misleading about the source. So within this paper, you're probably expected to write around 1.5 to 2 pages. It's not a huge question. It's actually only worth 8 marks. And those 8 marks, really, you can split into 2 sections, source A and source B. Time spent on this is approximately 15 minutes. That gives you time to read the sources, to maybe jot down a little plan ahead of time, and then to write your response. And in terms of examiner mark scheme, this particular question is looking at AO3, which is analyse, evaluate, and use sources to make substantiated judgments. All the time whilst you're looking at these sources, you need to have your critical, analytical head on, making judgments about, is this source useful for this particular inquiry? Now is the really important part of how to answer the question. It's all in the technique, and I'm going to teach you a particular structure that I follow and my students follow to guarantee they hit all of those 8 marks. And that structure I like to call CAP. The C in CAP stands for content. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at what we can learn from these sources. And when I say from inside the source, what I mean is this. Say we've been given a source and it's an image. Anything inside the image that I've highlighted in red here, I would consider to be inside the source. For example, this is a painting, but it could be an extract of text, it could be a poster, it could be a photograph. Anything within the text, within the picture itself, is what I say is inside the source. So what new information can we learn? And in order to talk about this, we are going to be making inferences. Now, the first thing I like to do to pick apart the source is I like to make a list of key things that I can see in it, or key quotes that I can read from it. In this particular source, the details that I can see are Hitler standing in the centre with a gun, the army are at the front of the source resisting Hitler, there are bodies on the ground, and Hitler's paramilitary are present in the background. Now, this is good to just start picking out details to use as an example in your writing. However, what the question is asking us is to consider what is useful about these details. So in order to do that, we need to turn those details into inferences. Now, I'm just going to go through in a bit more detail how we would turn each of those particular details into an inference, because then we are starting to add our own judgment and analytical thinking behind each one. So the first one, Hitler is standing with a gun. Instead, this can become Hitler is attempting to intimidate the German army by raising a pistol into the air during his march through Munich. What I'm doing here is I'm reading between the lines, and that is essentially what makes a good inference. Take what you can see, take your own understanding from your historical knowledge, and make a good educated guess about what is happening within the source. So here, I can't see intimidation, but I can infer that it's happening because Hitler is holding a gun. The next detail, the army are resisting, could change into something like this. The National German Army are clearly resisting Hitler following his attempt to stage a putsch using his paramilitary force. There are bodies on the ground, could become some Nazi brown shirts appear to be on the ground wounded or dead following a violent outbreak between the Nazi party and the authorities. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make the detail fit what I think is happening around the source. So maybe just before or just after. Think about what are the causes that have led to this? What are the consequences of the impact that's going to happen afterwards? That will help us pick apart the detail. And the last one, Hitler's paramilitary are present. Well, Hitler's attempt to seize power in Munich was aided by his private paramilitary force, the Brown Shirts, who have marched with him. Clearly, I have showed the examiner that I can see things happening in the painting, but I'm talking about what they represent rather than the literal interpretation of what I can see. Here's where you then need to link it back to the question. Throughout this paper, all the questions will always have a particular focus, and the key thing to do here to add our judgment is to always be linking back to the question. The best way to do this is by saying, this is useful because. Remember, the question asked us, why are these sources useful? So if we're saying this is useful because, the examiner can clearly see that we understand what the question has asked us to do. For example, this is useful because it shows how Hitler did not have full control of Germany's military and needed to use his own soldiers to achieve a takeover. I would ask you to constantly be thinking, why is it useful? Why is it useful? All the way through. Here we have another two of our inferences. This time we need to think again about their use towards the particular question. This is useful because it shows that the coup was unsuccessful, and following the violent outbreak, the army did open fire at the Nazi Party. The one on the right is useful because it shows that Hitler's methods to achieve his leadership relied heavily on violence and fear. So it's that extra sentence of judgment that you will remember to do if you use the phrase, this is useful because. The next letter in our acronym CAP is A for accuracy. Now, accuracy is really important because this is where, when we picked apart the question at the start, we are adding in our own knowledge. Essentially, what you are attempting to show the examiner is you can take this source and you can place it back into the history that it is happening within. This is called contextualization, or contextualizing the source. That way, we're going to decide if it is accurate. For example, if we had a piece of propaganda that was showing the Nazi Party absolutely supporting communism and seeing Stalin as some sort of role model, we would know that's not accurate because that doesn't fit our understanding of the Nazi Party's motivations or Hitler's general ideals. So we need to be able to understand that this source does exist from the time and it's accurate in the history it's telling us. So again, taking our source C here of the Munich Putsch. This time, we're not looking inside the source because everything that happens in our contextual knowledge is happening outside of the source. That is coming from inside your own brain. So that is our own knowledge. So what could our own knowledge look like? Well, what I like to do, first of all, is as soon as I read the question, I like to make a list of everything I know that happened between those years. So, for this source in particular, I know that the Munich Putsch happened in November 1923. I know that Hitler burst into the Bürgerbrauer Keller beer hall in Munich. I know that he interrupted a meeting with the Bavarian government leaders. I know that Hitler led his SA on a victory march through Munich, despite the fact that the leaders had called the authorities by this point. And I know that 16 members of the SA were killed when a scuffle broke out between the army and the SA, and Hitler eventually fled. We don't need to include all of this contextual knowledge, but what it helps us do is it helps us pick apart if this source in particular is showing what we already understand happened in the event. And again, we need to make our link. So, don't pick irrelevant context. Remember, there's that focus of the question. So, if you start telling a story about how Hitler's early growth in the Nazi Party came from his personal desire to have power and have purpose, then you're going off on a tangent that's not relevant to the question. So pick relevant context that links to this particular source. My second tip would be don't tell the story. This is not a historical narrative question, and the examiner isn't looking for if you understand what happened during this event. All the examiner is looking for is if you understand how this source fits back into its context. So what could those mistakes look like? Following the failure of this event, Hitler was arrested and placed in prison for 9 months, where he wrote Mein Kampf and considered a different approach to power. Great historical knowledge, but this source doesn't show us anything about the aftermath of the Munich Putsch, so it's irrelevant. And telling a story, we could start to go on about the events that unfolded during the Munich Putsch. It happened on the 8th of November 1923 in the state capital of Bavaria, Munich. And whilst 3 Bavarian leaders were having a meeting of right-wing nationalist-leaning parties, Hitler decided a strategic plan would be to, what you're doing is you're wasting part of your 15 minutes trying to tell a historical story. The last of our CAP technique is P for provenance. Provenance is essentially what is outside of the source. So when you look at the source, whether it's an image, whether it's writing, you will have a description of who wrote it and why. So here we have a painting of the putsch by H. Schmidt, one of Hitler's supporters who took part in the putsch. It shows Hitler in front of his rebels with his arms raised with a gun and Ludendorff on his right. So all of that is contextual knowledge that the exam board has given us to understand what this source is showing us. I like to think of 4 W's: who, what, why, and when. The important thing here that has come out from many examiner reports is don't try to talk about all 4 of them. Pick one and do it well, okay? So for example, with this source in particular, it isn't really telling us when it was created. So I'm picking out 2 here: who created it and what it actually is. Now we've already referred to it as a painting when we've been making inferences. So for this one in particular, I'm going to focus on the who. Now here we have that it's H. Schmidt, one of Hitler's supporters who took part in the putsch. Again, we're making our link by judging how useful that is for our inquiry. This is useful because it can demonstrate how Hitler's followers consider it to be a success for Hitler's personal image despite the putsch's failure. What we want to do is we want to make sure we are showing our understanding that the provenance affects how useful the source is. Now remember, we're not dismissing it and we're not just commenting on the fact that it might be bias or it might be an eyewitness account. Instead, we want that higher level analysis of saying this particular piece of provenance is really useful in a historical investigation because it tells us something more about why it was created. We could also say this is useful because it could reveal that Hitler was a driving force behind the putsch and that he was able to give inspiration to many nationalist followers. We could also say it's useful because Hitler's followers wanted to portray him as a hero, presenting him as the central figure in the success of the party. So just to recap our technique, we are using the acronym CAP: content, accuracy, provenance. On the screen now, you can see some useful sentence starters. So if you are practicing one of these responses at home, feel free to pause it here, have a look, jot down the sentence starters because these are a really great way to get the structure nailed in your written response. Section 3, model answers. What we have here are 2 model answers that are going to show us this technique in action. And I've highlighted where each section is going to appear as it shows up on the screen. This source is useful because it shows the aftermath of Hitler's attempt to seize power through the Munich Putsch, with the SA, brown shirts, marching through the streets of Munich, where a short violent struggle with the German National Army broke out. This is useful because it reveals how Hitler refused to accept the putsch had failed even after the 3 Bavarian leaders had been released. It is accurate because by midday on the 9th of November, the authorities had been called and Hitler's SA were attacked by the police, resulting in 16 casualties. This painting was created by one of Hitler's loyal followers, H. Schmidt, who appears to be celebrating the courage of Hitler to take on the German army. This is useful as it demonstrates how even after the putsch's failure, Nazi supporters look back on the event as a turning point for Hitler's heroic struggle against the Weimar. So let's pick apart what is good about this response in particular. So the first thing I've picked out, and I would pick out when I'm marking my student responses, is analytical language. I like to think of this language as revealers. How have you shown that this source reveals something about the history it is involved in? So I've picked out here shows, reveals, and demonstrates as 3 key language techniques to use. Then I've looked at evaluative inferencing. So where has this response made inferences about not just what the source is showing us literally, but what could be between the lines? So the aftermath of Hitler's attempt to seize power. It shows that Hitler's refusing to accept failure. It's showing that the painter is celebrating the courage of Hitler. And we could consider this a turning point for Hitler. The third thing is our own knowledge. So you can see the little section of the accuracy in the middle here. I have added a key date, 9th of November. I've added that the authorities were called because that isn't shown in the picture. We know that the SA were attacked by the police and it resulted in 16 casualties. So let's look at another example of a model answer. This source is useful because it shows how Hitler was a central figure in the Nazi Party's early strategy of getting into power. For example, we can see in source A that Hitler is displayed centrally within the painting and has been depicted in a fairly strong pose, raising his pistol in the air. This is useful as it reveals his early strategy of using violence and intimidation to attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government. It is accurate because Hitler relied heavily on his paramilitary group to intimidate political opponents, as well as provide him with a strong armed force due to his lack of support from a national army. This is a painting, which means it has been created after the event and therefore could be useful as showing how the party perceives Hitler as a central figure in the party's success, despite its failure. It is clear the putsch is being recalled as a momentous event. So let's do what we just did and pick apart what is good about this answer. Again, the analytical language that's chosen in this answer shows a high-level understanding of how the source could be used for that investigation. We're seeing words in here like shows, displayed, depicted, reveals, perceives, and recalls. These are all words that show that there is an intention behind why this source has been created, and it leads us into creating a sustained inference. The second thing of our evaluative inferencing is that we can see Hitler was a central figure. It was early strategy of getting into power. There's a strategy of using violence. It is a clear indication of it being a momentous event. And in terms of own knowledge, although I haven't put a particular date into this answer, it shows that I have an understanding that Hitler had a paramilitary group. His early strategy was intimidation of political opponents, and also he needed to use this technique because he didn't have the support of the German army yet. The last thing we're going to look at is examiner comments. These are taken straight from the examiner reports that are published from Pearson Edexcel after the exam series has finished. All the examiner comments are collated into one report, which is really nice for us to see what the exam board is expecting and what particular misconceptions some students had when they were going into the exam. The best responses were those that were able to address how useful by establishing the strengths sources have as evidence. Remember, we aren't just talking about these sources, they are evidence for a historical inquiry. We're not telling a story, we are using them to link back to that conceptual focus of the question. So, a couple of quick pointers for how to do this could look like the below. Therefore, it helps to understand X, or it is useful at showing Y. Comments which make simplistic remarks about the provenance, such as stating that the source comes from a witness, so it is useful, need to think about how utility can be addressed for this particular author in these circumstances. My advice here is don't fall into the trap of just saying a source is biased, or saying a source is useful because it's from an eyewitness. These are just scratching the surface of why a source is useful. Pick one key feature of provenance and do it well. For example, if you are talking about who wrote the source, it's clear that there is a reason. For example, if you are picking who wrote this source and you are going to say that it's biased, talk about why. Why would it be important that this particular person holds this view, and why would that aid us in an investigation into this history? Couple of key tips here. We could write it's an official government document which shows, or we could say it was a personal testimony which reveals. Often who wrote it also reveals a motivation behind why it was written as well. Contextual knowledge need not be highly detailed, but an awareness of the situations in which the sources were created is an essential part of any response. Again, this is where I said you are putting the source back into its historical context. You just need to show that you know when it comes from. So it will often give you a date range, or it will give you the conceptual focus. You just need to make sure that you understand some of the history surrounding that. Don't spend too long trying to impress the examiner on everything you know about this topic. Keep your context relevant and concise. Only use it if it is useful to the overall concept that it is asking you about. And the last comment we have here is reliability can only ever be a small element of utility, because an unreliable source can still be very useful. For example, if we're going to talk about propaganda, that has been created with the motivation of only presenting a one-sided view, but that doesn't make it unuseful. Instead, we can find validity and we can make comment in the fact that it is a biased view. For example, a high-level response is us being able to show when a source is useful even if it contradicts the question. An example I had of this when my class were doing some practice exam papers was a question about the Nazi ideals of women. The paper showed a photograph of women working in a factory, and what a lot of students fell into the trap of saying was it isn't useful because it's showing women at work when women were expected to be at home. But in fact, it is really useful because what it does is it shows us a subversion of the Nazi ideology. Yes, women were supposed to be at home having children, but in fact, many of the women contradicted this and chose to go to work anyway. We could say things like, this subverts the expected image of propaganda because, or this did not adhere to what the common theme was at the time. So here we are still commenting on its validity and we are not dismissing the source. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully that's given you some insight into Paper 3, Section B, Question 3A. And some techniques that you can go away and try now to do some practice exams at home. Thanks for watching.